It was the quiet chill of December in 1998 when the small town of Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, was wrapped in the kind of winter silence that could make even the smallest sound echo. Inside a cozy suburban home on 840 193rd Street, everything looked ordinary. Christmas decorations half done, family photos on the walls, and a sense of calm that hid something dark. Mark Jensen and his wife Julie had been married for over 14 years. They had 2 sons, David and Douglas, and from the outside they looked like the perfect American family. Comfortable home, happy children, and stability. But beneath that normal surface, something was cracking slowly. Something no one would notice until it was far too late. Julie Jensen was a gentle and thoughtful woman, known for her kindness, her devotion to her kids, and her sharp instincts. Over the years, however, she had begun to sense that something was wrong in her marriage. Mark, a stockbroker, had grown distant, often irritable, and sometimes secretive. She noticed changes: late nights at work, hushed phone calls, and an emotional wall between them that kept growing taller. Friends recalled Julie confiding that she no longer trusted her husband, that she was afraid something terrible was about to happen. That fear wasn't baseless. Around the same time, Julie began suspecting that Mark was having an affair. There were subtle signs: a strange number on his phone bill, sudden gym visits, and moments when he seemed emotionally absent. She confronted him a few times, but Mark brushed it off with charm and excuses. To outsiders, Mark was intelligent, calm, and composed, a man who seemed incapable of losing control. But Julie, living under the same roof, felt the tension that others couldn't see. In late November 1998, Julie started feeling sick. It began with minor symptoms: fatigue, nausea, and a sore throat, but soon escalated to violent vomiting and weakness. She visited her doctor, who thought it might be a viral infection. Mark appeared to be a caring husband, bringing her juice and medicine, but something about his calm demeanor unsettled Julie. Her intuition was screaming that something wasn't right. Around that time, she made a decision that would later become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. Julie wrote a letter to her neighbor and handed it to a close friend, saying, "If anything happens to me, give this to the police." The letter described her fear that Mark was planning to kill her. She mentioned that she had found things in the house that made her uneasy: antifreeze bottles, strange searches on the family computer, and Mark's unusual calmness about her deteriorating health. In the letter, she wrote chillingly, "If I die, please make sure the police look at Mark as the first suspect." That note, simple yet terrifying, was Julie's last desperate attempt to protect herself from what she felt was inevitable. As days passed, her condition worsened. She was vomiting greenish fluid, too weak to get out of bed, and her body was shutting down. Mark told their friends that she was suffering from depression and possibly suicidal thoughts. He even told people that Julie had mentioned ending her own life, an idea that none of her friends believed. Julie was a loving mother, deeply connected to her kids, and there was no sign she would harm herself. Then came December 3rd, 1998. The morning started quietly. The boys left for school, and Mark claimed that Julie was still sleeping when he went to work. When he returned home that afternoon, he said he found her unresponsive in bed. He called 911, his voice steady, almost cold. When paramedics arrived, Julie Jensen was dead. The initial investigation didn't immediately scream foul play. There were no visible signs of struggle, and her death appeared peaceful. Toxicology tests were ordered, but results would take weeks. The scene looked calm, perhaps too calm. On her bedside table were some notes, a few medications, and what appeared to be a glass with some residue. When news of her death spread, friends and family were devastated, but some were suspicious. They remembered her letter, the warnings she gave, the fear in her voice. Within days, that letter made its way to the police. It was chilling to read. "I would never take my own life because of my kids. Mark would be my first suspect if anything happens to me." That single piece of paper changed everything. Police now began to see the scene differently. They searched the Jensen home again and began looking into Mark's background. What they found confirmed Julie's fears. On the family computer, detectives uncovered searches related to poison, specifically ethylene glycol, the main chemical in antifreeze. They also found email exchanges suggesting Mark had been having an affair with a co-worker named Kelly Labonte. Kelly was a co-worker from Mark's office, young, attractive, and reportedly in love with him. Investigators soon learned that Mark had promised her a life together, telling her that his marriage was unhappy and that Julie was holding him back. The two exchanged passionate messages, with Mark once writing, "Soon everything will be over and we can be together without secrets." These discoveries painted a grim picture. A man who had grown tired of his wife, caught in an affair, and secretly planning her death to start over. But at the time, the evidence was still circumstantial. Toxicology reports eventually revealed high levels of ethylene glycol in Julie's system, confirming that she had been poisoned with antifreeze. The pattern of her symptoms matched perfectly with the chemical's effects. First confusion, then kidney failure, and finally respiratory collapse. Detectives now had motive, opportunity, and physical evidence. Yet Mark Jensen maintained his innocence. He told police that Julie had been depressed and might have poisoned herself to punish him. It was a shocking claim, but Mark seemed confident. He even handed police a note that he said Julie had written, supposedly confessing suicidal thoughts. However, handwriting experts later said the letter appeared forced and inconsistent with her writing style. Over the next few years, the case would become one of the most controversial and drawn-out investigations in Wisconsin history. Legal battles over evidence, delays, and Mark's ability to manipulate perception made it a slow burn toward justice. For nearly a decade, Julie's family waited for answers, holding on to that one letter she had written as her final cry for help. By the time authorities gathered enough evidence to arrest Mark Jensen, nearly 10 years had passed. In 2007, he was finally charged with the murder of his wife, accused of slowly poisoning her while pretending to be a loving husband. But this was only the beginning of a long, twisted courtroom saga that would test the limits of trust, truth, and justice. The story of Julie Jensen wasn't just about a murder. It was about a woman who foresaw her own death, about warnings ignored, and about the sinister calm of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone. The quiet town of Pleasant Prairie had no idea that behind one of its suburban doors, a husband was orchestrating one of the most chilling and cold-blooded murders in modern America. After Julie Jensen's death, the town of Pleasant Prairie tried to move on, but whispers never stopped. The idea that a loving wife could write a letter predicting her own murder was something no one could shake off. Police continued digging, quietly but persistently. Every small clue was re-examined, every search on the Jensen home computer analyzed, and every timeline detail checked again. What they found was disturbing. Just weeks before Julie's death, Mark had researched methods of poisoning that were difficult to detect. He had visited multiple websites about ethylene glycol and even downloaded toxicology reports. Investigators also discovered that he had bought antifreeze, supposedly to winterize his car, even though the vehicle didn't need it at the time. The more they looked, the clearer it became. Julie hadn't died by her own hand. She had been methodically murdered. Julie's letter became the emotional center of the case. It was read over and over by detectives and prosecutors, a woman's desperate attempt to leave behind her truth. She had written, "I pray I'm wrong, but I fear my husband is planning my death." That single sentence made even hardened investigators pause. They knew that the case wasn't just about evidence anymore. It was about a woman's voice from beyond the grave. But building a legal case around that letter wasn't easy. The defense argued that it was hearsay, an out-of-court statement that couldn't be used as direct evidence. Prosecutors, however, believed it was the key to unlocking Mark's intent. For years, both sides fought over whether Julie's words could even be read in court. The letter became so famous that law professors across the US called it the most haunting piece of evidence ever written by a victim. In the meantime, Mark continued to live freely. He sold the family home, moved away, and began living with his former mistress, Kelly Labonte. Together, they tried to build a new life. To those who didn't know his past, Mark appeared like a calm, intelligent man, rebuilding after tragedy. But to Julie's family, it was unbearable to see him live as if nothing had happened. Her parents wrote letters to prosecutors, begging for justice, reminding them that Julie's warnings had been clear and real. As investigators gathered evidence, they began interviewing Kelly Labonte again. She admitted to her affair with Mark, but claimed she had no idea what he had done. When asked if Mark ever mentioned getting rid of Julie, Kelly hesitated. There were moments, she said, when he would make chilling comments, like saying life would be easier if certain things were no longer in the way. Those comments haunted her later, once she knew Julie's cause of death. Detectives pieced together a timeline. Julie had started feeling sick after Thanksgiving, right when Mark's searches for poison began. He had allegedly mixed antifreeze into her orange juice or tea, giving her small doses over time. When she grew weaker, he pretended to be a caring husband, documenting her illness with notes and photographs to make it look like a natural decline. Investigators later found those photos on his computer, images of Julie lying weak in bed. It was a disturbing display of manipulation and control. When questioned, Mark always stayed calm, almost detached. He never showed much emotion about Julie's death, speaking in a flat tone about how she had been struggling emotionally. He told police she had been paranoid, even claiming she had mentioned poisoning herself to get back at him. But his version of events never matched the people who truly knew Julie. Her friends and co-workers described her as grounded, loving, and focused on her children. Finally, in 2007, nearly a decade after Julie's death, prosecutors felt confident enough to charge Mark Jensen with first-degree intentional homicide. His arrest shocked the community. The trial would become one of the most watched in Wisconsin history, not just for the crime itself, but for the emotional depth of the evidence. When the trial began in 2008, the courtroom was filled with tension. Julie's parents sat in the front row every day, clutching her photograph. Mark sat at the defense table, well-dressed, expressionless, his eyes cold and analytical. Prosecutors started with Julie's letter. They told the jury that Julie Jensen had predicted her own murder, that she had left behind her final testimony. Then they described the poison, antifreeze, a substance that causes a slow, excruciating death. The medical examiner took the stand and described in detail how ethylene glycol damages the body, how it first makes the victim feel drunk, then nauseous, then slowly destroys the kidneys and shuts down vital organs. The testimony made the courtroom silent. Everyone could imagine Julie's suffering, trapped in her own body, poisoned by the person she trusted most. Then came the emotional part, the letter itself. The prosecution read Julie's words aloud, line by line. "I would never take my own life because of my kids." If anything happens to me, please make sure Mark is the first suspect." Her words echoed through the courtroom like a ghostly whisper. Reporters later wrote that even jurors had tears in their eyes. The defense, led by a skilled team, countered aggressively. They argued that Julie was mentally unstable, paranoid, and possibly suicidal. They claimed she had planted the evidence against her husband to frame him out of resentment. Mark's lawyer even pointed out that Julie had been reading online about poisoning and might have intentionally mimicked those symptoms. It was a shocking defense, one that painted the victim as her own killer. But prosecutors had more. They presented Mark's internet history, showing searches for antifreeze poisoning symptoms, how to detect ethylene glycol, and how long it takes for antifreeze to kill. They also showed phone records revealing hundreds of calls between Mark and Kelly during the time Julie was dying. The affair was undeniable. The jury saw a picture of a man who wanted freedom, passion, and control, and who had found a cruel way to get it. Throughout the trial, Mark showed little emotion. When photos of Julie in her final days were shown, he looked down briefly but never cried. Prosecutors said his calmness was chilling, a reflection of his sociopathic control. Then, the most controversial twist came: whether Julie's letter could legally be used. The defense appealed mid-trial, claiming her note violated Mark's right to confront his accuser, since Julie was not alive to be cross-examined. The legal debate went all the way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. After weeks of argument, the court ruled that the letter could stay. It was crucial to understanding Julie's state of mind and the events leading to her death. That ruling changed the course of the case. With the letter admissible, the jury had direct insight into Julie's fear, her intuition, and her desperate attempt to survive. As the trial neared its end, both sides made powerful closing arguments. The prosecution described Julie as a woman silenced by the man she loved, and her letter as her voice reaching out for justice. The defense painted Mark as a husband trapped in a failing marriage with a depressed wife. The contrast was stark, one side fighting for Julie's truth, the other trying to rewrite it. In February 2008, after weeks of testimony, the jury went into deliberation. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited. Hours turned into a day, then another. Finally, the jury returned. When the foreman read the verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Julie's family broke down in tears, holding each other tightly. For them, it was justice long delayed but finally delivered. Mark Jensen, emotionless, simply looked straight ahead as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even then, the story didn't end. Mark appealed multiple times, claiming his trial had been unfair because of the letter's inclusion. Years later, in 2013, an appeals court actually overturned his conviction, saying the letter should not have been used as evidence. The case was sent back for a retrial. For Julie's family, it was a crushing blow. They had believed the nightmare was finally over. Now, they had to relive it all again. But prosecutors didn't give up. They rebuilt the case, this time focusing more on physical and digital evidence and less on the letter. They brought in new witnesses, forensic experts, and even statements from Mark's former lover, Kelly, who finally revealed more about his cold attitude and his controlling behavior. The retrial took years to prepare, but by 2023, the case was back in court. Julie's memory, even after 2 decades, still haunted everyone involved. Nearly 25 years had passed since that winter morning in 1998, when Julie Jensen was found dead in her bed. The world had changed, her children had grown up, and technology had advanced. But the shadow of that case never faded. In Wisconsin, the name Mark Jensen had become synonymous with betrayal and cold calculation. Yet, after the appeal and overturned conviction, there was still one question echoing through the halls of justice. Would Julie ever truly get peace? When the retrial began, it was as if the past had come back to life. The courtroom once again filled with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and locals who remembered the story that had haunted their community. The prosecution, this time, knew they couldn't rely heavily on Julie's letter, not because it wasn't powerful, but because the courts had restricted its direct use. They needed to prove Mark's guilt through other means: science, psychology, and his own actions. By now, Mark Jensen was older, greyer, but still had that same calm expression that had unsettled everyone years earlier. He walked into the courtroom wearing a suit, carrying a binder, looking almost like a businessman attending a meeting. But beneath that calm exterior was a man accused once again of one of the coldest murders imaginable, killing his wife slowly with poison while pretending to be her caregiver. The prosecutors began by focusing on the digital trail. Technology had improved drastically since 1998, and forensic experts were now able to recover more detailed data from the Jensen family's old computer backups. They found records of deleted searches, fragments of cached pages, and even an email draft that Mark had once started but never sent, describing antifreeze and how it takes time to work. It was as if the machine itself had held onto his secret all these years, waiting for someone to find it. Then came the medical experts. They explained how Julie's symptoms could not have been self-inflicted. The level of ethylene glycol in her system indicated multiple doses over time, which would have been nearly impossible for a person as weak as she was to administer to herself. Moreover, the absence of fingerprints on the antifreeze container spoke volumes. Everything pointed toward a deliberate, methodical poisoning. As the evidence was presented, Mark sat silently, taking notes. Occasionally, he would shake his head subtly, as if disagreeing, but he never showed anger or guilt. His sons, now grown men, had chosen to stay mostly private during the retrial, torn between the love of a mother they lost and the father they barely understood anymore. Prosecutors brought in former colleagues, neighbors, and even the woman who had once been his mistress, Kelly Labonte. By now, Kelly's life had taken a completely different path. She appeared nervous but composed. She spoke about how Mark had once told her that Julie's death was meant to happen, and how he had shown little grief after it happened. When asked if Mark ever expressed regret, she said quietly, "No, he never did." Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade. The defense, once again, tried to paint Julie as emotionally unstable. But after so many years, that argument felt hollow. People remembered Julie as a bright, loving woman who adored her children. Even the jury could feel her presence through the stories told by her friends, who described her fear and her instincts that something was terribly wrong. At one point, the prosecution played a video montage, photos of Julie, smiling with her kids, family gatherings, vacations, Christmas mornings. Then came the photos taken near the end, pale, weak, eyes sunken. The contrast was unbearable. It told the story of a woman whose life had been drained away slowly, not by fate, but by someone she trusted completely. As the retrial progressed, the evidence formed a web of deceit too detailed to dismiss. Mark's internet searches, the antifreeze purchase, his affair, his calm demeanor, and his attempts to manipulate the narrative all aligned into one horrifying truth. This was not an accident, not suicide, but premeditated murder. Then came the final testimonies. Julie's friends described her last days, how she had whispered that she was afraid to sleep, that she felt something was happening to her body that she couldn't explain. One recalled her saying, "I think he's trying to kill me." The courtroom went silent. There was no way to argue that these words were the imagination of a paranoid woman. They were the cries of someone fighting for her life. After weeks of evidence, the case went to the jury again. The courtroom, packed with reporters and citizens who had followed the case for decades, waited for the outcome. The air was thick with tension, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Mark Jensen sat motionless, his hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. When the jury finally returned, their faces told the story before the verdict was even read. The foreperson stood and announced, "We find the defendant, Mark Jensen, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide." The courtroom erupted in emotion. Julie's family, after more than 2 decades, finally exhaled. Her parents held hands, tears streaming down their faces. One of her friends whispered, "She can rest now." Even some jurors were seen wiping their eyes. Mark, as always, showed no visible reaction. His face stayed blank, unreadable, as though he was still trying to process that the walls had finally closed in. The judge thanked the jury for their service and then turned to Mark Jensen, sentencing him once again to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This time, there would be no more appeals, no more technicalities. The evidence had spoken louder than any letter could. Julie Jensen's intuition, her courage to write that note, and her unwavering love for her children had guided the case to its rightful end. As he was led away, reporters called out his name, asking if he had anything to say. Mark remained silent, staring ahead. It was the same silence he had kept for 25 years, one that had haunted everyone who knew the truth. Outside the courthouse, Julie's family stood before cameras. Her brother spoke softly. "Julie warned us. She tried to save herself and her children. Today, her voice was finally heard." Her parents, too emotional to speak, simply nodded. They had waited years for this day, through appeals, reversals, and endless court dates. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. In the days that followed, newspapers across the US carried the story again. Mark Jensen found guilty 25 years after wife's murder. The case became a symbol of perseverance, of how truth can survive even through time and manipulation. Even law schools studied the Jensen case as a lesson in how the victim's voice, even from beyond the grave, can guide an investigation. Julie's letter, though legally limited, had been the spark that started everything. Without it, her death might have been dismissed as natural or self-inflicted. Instead, her courage ensured that her story was never forgotten. Mark Jensen remains in prison today, serving his life sentence. He continues to maintain his innocence, but the world sees his story differently. A man whose pride and selfishness led to unimaginable cruelty. Julie's sons grew up without their mother, but they also grew up knowing she had fought in her own way to protect them. Her friends often say that Julie's strength lies in that letter, a document written not in fear, but in love, determination, and instinct. As the years pass, her story continues to echo through podcasts, documentaries, and true crime shows. It's not just about murder, it's about intuition, courage, and the warning signs people often overlook. Julie Jensen became more than a victim. She became a symbol of every person who ever felt something was wrong but wasn't believed. And so, the story of Mark and Julie Jensen ends where it began, in a quiet Wisconsin neighborhood with snow falling outside and a family torn apart by betrayal. The house where it all happened stands as a reminder of what was lost and what it took to uncover the truth. For those who study crime or believe in justice, the Jensen case remains a chilling lesson. Sometimes evil hides behind normal smiles. Sometimes love turns lethal. And sometimes the most powerful testimony is written not in a courtroom, but in a letter, by a woman who refused to let her voice be silenced. If you found this story haunting yet powerful, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest sides of human nature. And remember, truth always finds its way, no matter how long it takes. See you in the next story.